So we're gonna start off our first panel. I'm very excited for it. We've titled it Building a Diverse Climate Movement in the Prairies. We've got an amazing lineup for you. Well, I sound like a sports announcer. We've got an amazing lineup for you. But we do. And so first up, I'm gonna introduce our moderator of this panel. So we've got Chetna, who is on the corner there, and I'll hand the mics to them for a second. But Chetna is a second-year PhD student in the sociology department at the University of Calgary. She analyzes social movements across North America and South Asia, with an emphasis on narratives within activism on all sides of the political spectrum. Chetna's PhD research will adopt a global lens to study the intersections of environmental justice and migration within climate advocacy. Chetna also conducts design-based research reimagining environmental justice from the perspective of newcomer youth of color in Canada. She's most interested in the intersections of environmentalism with migration, animal rights, decoloniality, and anti-racism. So just also a quick, sorry, give a round of applause for Chetna. And a quick reminder to all of the speakers here to just use the mic. So we'll have you all kind of pass it down, but I'll give the mic now to Chetna. Thank you.
Thank you for the lovely introduction, Hope. Yeah, I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for organizing this event and having us here in this space for critical, emergent, climate-related discussions. I'll start with introducing our technical panelists here. I'm really excited to talk to them. I'll start with Walter Andreef, who prefers he/him pronouns. Walter is a Métis man living in Slave Lake with knowledge in Indigenous-led land use assessments, a deep familiarity with Métis Nation governments and rights, and crucial experience in some of the best practices for Indigenous participation, collaboration, consultation, and intercommunity partnership within environmental or impact assessments. He loves the land and the entire beauty of Mother Earth and all of its natural wonders. He's also a trained climate leader and a rock climber as well as a mushroom lover. Welcome, Walter. Next, we're joined by Larissa Crawford, who prefers she/her pronouns. Larissa proudly passes on Métis and Jamaican ancestry to her daughter, Zaira. She is a published Indigenous anti-racism and climate justice researcher, policy advisor, and restorative circle keeper with over 15 years of experience. Larissa is also the founder of Future Ancestors Services, which is an Indigenous and Black-owned, youth-led professional services social enterprise that advocates for climate justice and systemic barrier removal while adopting lenses of anti-racism and ancestral accountability. Through an intergenerational, disabled, and queer team of professionals and advisors, they provide speaking, training, research, and consulting services, as well as influencer and interview services to over 400 diverse clients. They do this while centering decolonized and indigenized practices, and are constantly reimagining how we can learn, relate, and work together in healthy ways. Welcome. Next, I'll introduce Tomi Ajele, who prefers she/her pronouns. Tomi is a storyteller, civic activator, and community collaborator. She is a senior communications officer at the Legislative Assembly of Alberta, the board president of Plastic Free YYC, a freelance writer, and the former editor-in-chief of Afros in the City. She holds a bachelor's degree in public relations from Mount Holyoke University and a master's in public policy from the University of Calgary. In 2022, Tomi was named one of Avenue Magazine's top 40 under 40. And our last inspiring panelist is Subashini Thangadurai, who prefers she/her pronouns. Subashini is a 17-year-old climate advocate. She has a passion for working in the climate movement in the hopes of creating a just, inclusive, creative, and innovative future. She became a trained climate reality leader in 2020, and since then she has continued to be involved in her community. Subashini is an enthusiastic advocate for climate education, and she also enjoys helping the school community take on environmental initiatives. She's also an aspiring poet who uses words as a means to inspire action. She feels immense gratitude for being able to have the opportunity to use her voice in the climate movement. Welcome, Subashini. Yeah, we got some excellent, inspiring speakers here, so let's get the conversation started. I'll be asking our panelists some questions about meaningful engagement with diversity within climate action. And I will request that you keep your responses to 5 minutes for each question, just so we get a chance to hear from everyone. So my first question is, what challenges have we faced in the work of diversifying the climate movement? We can start with you, since you're closest to me.
Yeah, sure. I mean, to be honest, I do think, like, from the limited experience I have, I do think my experience has been one where I have been, like, quite lucky without really necessarily facing too much adversity. And I do think part of that comes from being able to make connections in a community like us, which I do think is quite lucky, and like being surrounded by friends and family who like do support me. So I do think I would like to pass this right on to like people. Thank you so much.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank Marilyn for the prayer to start us off today. And I recognize that I'm on the ancestral treaty homelands of the people of Treaty 7. And I'm pleased to be here. I used to live here in Calgary, and I got my education at the University of Calgary as well. I think that there is opportunities for further engagement, particularly in the Alberta rural areas, like where I live, where we tend to live a little bit of a different lifestyle, where we're more at risk of weather events that can affect travel, can affect our homes, can affect our livelihoods, and that kind of thing. So I live in Slave Lake, Alberta, which is sort of right on the eastern tip of Lesser Slave Lake. And over the past 5 to 6 years, we've had some huge fires, as well as some fairly prominent floods that had several evacuations. People may remember the community of East Prairie Métis settlement. It's about an hour, not too far from where I live. And I don't know quite a few of those people who were evacuated, and some people who lost their land, and I don't know the people who lost their homes, but there was a few that have homes built for them. This is the factor of our, we live in a boreal forest. Forest fires in the old days used to come periodically, and people made adjustments. But with the increase in temperatures and the dryness in the forest, in which I see, I'm also a hunter-gatherer. I can see the changes when I'm out there on the lands, taking our people out to do assessments of various projects that are underway in that particular region. That there are changes, and the ground is dry, and all it needs is a spark to get it going. So when I talk with people in the municipalities, and sometimes and at times talk with people in coffee conversations, that there still needs to be a way for the message to get out to the rural areas. I think that when I'm in the city here, many people in the city, maybe not everybody, because there's still people out there who don't believe in climate change, but in the rural areas, there's a gap in education, and there's a gap in knowledge. At different times when I've been sitting as part of the committee, as on the circle, we talked about using different types of communication tools. I think here in Alberta, we're going to have to do that. We're going to have to reach out to those rural areas, the MDs, the community papers, and present perspectives on climate change and the environment, particularly as it means to people in Western Canada. Because the way we receive our news now on our phones and on our television, even when I was talking earlier to other people, when the evacuation to East Prairie took place and lots of other Métis people were evacuated to the south, it took up a few news items and then it was eclipsed by something else, and so it fades from people's minds. What's actually happening. So what we need to do, I think, is to reach out outside of the cities and actually engage with the rural areas in some form, whether it be through websites or whether it be through social media, and help bring a climate literacy to those areas where there's, there are skeptics. And I don't know exactly how that program should work, but I think there's an opportunity there for all of us to be leaders. I should say I've been part of the climate movement, I think since 1990, but only a leader within climate reality since about 2018. And I'm really encouraged by all the young people and all of the people who are volunteering and spending their time about this issue, which is very, very precious to many people. I was joyfully surprised when I was in Edmonton a few years ago when Greta Thunberg came there and spoke at the legislature grounds. And I had never seen crowds that large in my entire life or in the environmental perspective. Ran into a couple of friends who were from Manitoba. What were you doing there? Anyway, interesting, but there is a spirit of awakening, but we've got to keep on working on that. We've got to keep on communicating. We've got to keep having thoughtful conversations and taking and those of us who move into their careers, look at the management side of things and make those changes within whatever organization I've been part of. I don't know, am I 5 minutes yet? I'll just hand over to them.
That was so great. Thank you, Robert. Especially making that connection to like the rural realities. Larissa, Crawford, Calgary, we can meet anything question qui Jamaican intern. Bonjour, je m'appelle Larissa, j'ai une ascendance métisse, de anything question, et une ascendance afro-canadienne d'origine. Et ma famille francophone est du nord de la. Hi. I always take a moment to acknowledge myself in ancestral languages, and so first in the Chip and then in French. Also acknowledging this is a bilingual program, which has been really amazing to see because so often francophone spaces are left out of climate and sustainability conversations. And when we talk about the rural-urban kind of divide, especially in northern Alberta, where there's primarily francophone communities and across the prairies, this is a really important gap that y'all are filling, so I really appreciate that. And I also take a moment to introduce myself and my ancestry because it's relevant, because it contributes to my qualification to be here to talk in and engage in climate reality and climate movements, I would say, and it contributes to yours as well. And that's kind of, I think, how my responses are going to be flowing today. But in terms of the biggest challenges, there's a couple, and I'd say a lot of it comes down to worldview. So to illustrate this, I have a favorite quote from Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And if you're ever interested in expanding kind of your understanding of our relationship to Earth through a decolonized lens, it's a great kind of starting point. But in her book, she says, okay, I'm going to try to quote this as best as I can. In the settler mind, land was property, real estate, or natural resources. But to our people, it was everything. Our pharmacy, our library, our connection to our ancestors, the source of all that sustained us. And what I really like about this quote is that it illustrates the biggest challenge I navigate in my work. And that is, we see a settler worldview where we see Earth as something to be bought, something to be owned, as property, as real estate, and it's reflected in our policies, it's reflected in our social norms, it's reflected in our aspirations and our goals. And that worldview and consequential truth of a relationship to Earth is often positioned as the only legitimate or true truth. And that other reality, so other worldviews where we see Earth as an extension of self, as Earth as a teacher, as Earth as a pharmacy, as our economy. When we see Earth in that way, and then the consequential relationship to Earth, that is often positioned as too spiritual, as nice to have, or at best needs to be proven through a Western scientific worldview or approach before we can deem it valid. And that's what I see in so much of our work. So with Future Ancestor Services, we prioritize community activist-led work. And so we do a lot of engagement and learning from them. But then we also work with pretty much every federal ministry in Canada. We work a lot with Natural Resources Canada, ECCC, and then a lot of kind of big foundations and organizations. So we work across the sector, and we work in energy, conservation, natural resources, et cetera. And consistently, this is where we're seeing the most harm caused. And I really like actually looking to the north, because we're seeing so much innovation happening in the north. And I think in the prairies, in the south, especially in the southern part of the prairies, we often forget that so much of the prairies are also in the north. And in a context where if we don't collaborate, if we don't figure our shit out, to be honest, then we aren't going to live through the winter, then we aren't going to get food or water to our communities. And that's what we see. And so because of that kind of scarcity and that necessity, we're seeing incredible conflict resolution approaches, co-management regimes coming out of the north. And so I really like to look to the north for inspiration and leadership when we're considering what we should be doing at a policy level, at an organizational level in the South. And one instance that really highlighted the worldview issue for me was doing work in Yukon and coming across the history of the Kluane National Park. And so Kluane National, it was formerly Kluane National Game Reserve. And in 1948, I want to say, it was created as a conservation area by Western scientists and policymakers, saying we need to remove everyone and all human activity from this conservation area to support the environment, to replenish the animals, etc. And that was done, and there was very violent removal of the Champagne, the Ashek, and the Kluane First Nations off of their traditional territories. And this was done under with the understanding that humans need to be separate from nature in order for it to be nature, in order for it to be wild. We have to see ourselves as separate from the ecosystem. And so that was used to justify violent removal from those lands. But what ended up happening was that by 1972, they found, okay, you guys can actually come back. Sorry. You guys can come back, you guys can use the land as you want, etc. And people didn't. There was a lot of harm, there was intergenerational trauma. There had been a cultural genocide that had very real impacts on the people by 1972. And what they had also found was that these policies and conservation approaches that were exclusively done through a Western scientific view actually harmed the ecosystem, and not only the people, but again, the ecosystem. By removing an apex predator from an ecosystem, humans, another apex predator, wolves, became overpopulated and destabilized the ecosystem. They had not listened to the First Nations. They had not listened to traditional knowledge. They hadn't listened to what they knew about migration and ecosystem balance. And they ended up harming the earth and environment and people instead of leveraging the wealth of knowledge that they had. And in talking to the policymakers that led the co-regime that came out of that co-management regime, where now the First Nations co-manage the park with the government, this was their biggest challenge in getting people to acknowledge the harm that had been caused because of the worldview through which those conservation efforts had been exclusively done. And what ended up coming out of this co-management regime was a cultural, an indicator of ecosystem success and health and well-being, where we see cultural reintegration to original traditional uses of the land with the land, as a marker of ecological health and well-being. So we also saw an incredibly innovative practice come out of broadening our scope of what is valuable knowledge, who carries valuable knowledge, and how we can act on that valuable knowledge. So that's kind of one of the challenges that I see come across in all of my work. And that's something that I really try to enlighten in kind of these kind of spaces, is really thinking about whose knowledge are we considering valid, legitimate, and then how are we acting on that knowledge?
I love that. I feel like I'm processing a lot of what you just said, and I really appreciate how you kind of kicked that off by talking about how identity is such an important part of the qualifications, even kind of having these conversations and bringing bringing yourself into this space. And I think that's really important. I think that's one of the things that I've noticed as the biggest challenge, is that sort of lack of awareness or appreciation of the intersectionality of it all. And I think it's really easy for us to kind of toss that word around. But in practice, what does it actually mean? And I think that there is such a disconnect with a lot of the kind of like climate justice work that I see, and a lot of the issues that are happening in the world. And I sometimes hear a lot of kind of, oh yeah, why don't these people care that the world is burning? Why don't they care? And I'm like, because their world is burning. It has been burning, and you don't care. And like, there are these really pressing, really emergent issues that a lot of people are facing. And I feel like there are a lot of climate movements that operate in a vacuum and act as though and function as though these are not interconnected. And they're like, why don't these people care? And like, that's a whole thing. So I think that a really important piece of this is connecting back to that why. If you feel like you're in a climate justice space or a climate movement and it feels disconnected, I think connecting back to that why. People are allowed to have different reasons for why they care, that's fine. But if you care about the people, if you care about the future generations, if you want kids one day, or you have kids and you care about the world that they're inheriting and they're gonna grow up in, then you have to care about the people. You have to care about mass genocide that's happening. You have to care about what's happening in the world. And I'm not saying that you have to fix it, but if your climate action is operating in a vacuum, if it's disconnected from the other elements of the world, and it's really important for us to kind of sit back and take a minute and ask why do I care? And if it is about the land, if it is about your connection to earth, and we have to think about and care about the systems that rob us of our ability to connect to the earth. And I feel like this spoke a lot to that, these ways of thinking and these sort of preferred ways of knowing. We have to think about that and care about like what are the systems that make it difficult for us to be sort of tender caregivers of this land, and how does this all interconnect? So I think those are some of the biggest challenges for sure that I've seen, is just really operating in a vacuum, and by doing that, really alienating a lot of the people that hold the knowledge that we need in order to find solutions.
So much for those really powerful words. I really appreciate where the scope of this conversation was led, beginning from maybe acknowledging some of the comforts that we felt within the movement, to the lack of education and climate education spread across Canada equally, and also looking at decolonizing our epistemologies and not just using that as a token word. And by epistemologies, that just mean everything that Tomi and Larissa have been talking about, our ways of knowing, the way in which we construct knowledge, how we don't prioritize relational worldviews and give more preference to capitalist worldviews. Thank you for sharing so much with us. That does give us a smooth transition going to our next question. So while we aspire to build a diverse and inclusive climate movement, there are important things to consider and avoid. How can we ensure that inclusivity doesn't just equate to tokenistic representation, but truly extends audiences and community participation in the climate movement?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the perspective I can try and bring here is kind of being in the climate movement. And I think a lot of the spaces I have been, I sometimes do have to consider like, is it kind of tokenism of like, are you being like heard in the best way? And I think the way I kind of approach that is like doing kind of, I guess, research into the opportunities we do seek out, and then just trying to be kind of authentic and honest about the experiences like kind of I've had, and like acknowledging like the privilege that comes with that. And I do think tokenism is unfortunately, I guess, a part of the struggles of being a climate advocate at times. And yeah, I think that's my answer.
Thank you. As part of the Indigenous Advisory Circle, I'm there with several other people from different nations across Canada, and it's been a privilege to be part of the leadership meetings and to give perspectives on the land and ways of knowing, and discussions on the importance of the land and the spirit. We've got some really good speakers on our Indigenous Advisory Circle, and some of the men. We've got one gentleman who's from the far north. We've got another one from Benanake, which is right next to Montreal, and others from Eastern Canada, and myself from the west. I think that we play a great role with the leadership in sort of getting a perspective across that all of the business of organizing climate reality is very, very important, but it's also important for the organization to have a soul, for the organization to be a movement of people with like minds and goodwill, and working towards a common purpose. And a lot of those discussions that we have within those meetings, I think are really good in bringing not only a different perspective, but also it's, I can hear some of and see some of those actions in how the climate reality has formed over the years and what they're doing today across the country. I think it's wonderful having these sets of workshops here and in Saskatchewan, as well as Winnipeg, and reaching out to engage with the people who are actually living in those areas and getting a different perspective from each location, and the different different elders too, who maybe attended from different locations as well. So I think I think that the organization has gone quite a ways from that perspective. And I think I've been sort of pushing a little bit more too at the leadership level, that, it's also time to visit some of the local reserves, or where the Indigenous people live, and start to make some of those connections with the different organizations. And here in Calgary, I know that from living here myself, I moved north in 2004, but I spent quite a bit of time here in Calgary. There's quite a few Indigenous organizations here you can reach out to with the message of climate, and hear a message back as well, and be more inclusive from that perspective. And there's other avenues to seek out as well. And each person here knows another person within the community, maybe a leader, but it's important to reach out to all of those. And I look at people who are out here, and I look at the people who are from the organization organization. I look at the people in the Eastern Canada, Quebec. And, you know, I feel that we're a very inclusive organization. Is it ever perfect? No. So the part of the work of the organization and individuals is to kind of bring that message wherever you can to different other organizations that, you know, you may brush up against in your day-to-day life. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I really like this question of inclusivity and tokens and navigating that. To maybe illustrate tokenism, let me speak really quickly to some of the ways that my lived experiences inform, again, my qualification to be working in climate spaces that you don't see just looking at me. So, I grew up in a trailer park, about an hour and a half, probably 2 hours away from here, Water Valley. Does anyone know where that is? Yeah, hey, yeah, Water Valley Rodeo. So, yeah, grew up, yeah, food bank poor. Oftentimes didn't have access to water, heating, for a number of different reasons. But grew up outside, grew up on the land, and I loved that time. I don't remember a lot about my childhood, but I remember very vividly so many memories from growing up on the land. And when I think of how that transfers into my values and worldviews today, I learned so much from berry picking season, from learning what plants not to touch, from learning that it's a safe space when you go in there with the respect of knowledge and awareness that it deserves, that she deserves, that Earth deserves. This might be unconventional to mention, and maybe the moderator or Hope can share kind of some resources for support after if anything I say is triggering. But I started experiencing sexual assault when I was in grade 6, and I was raped for the first time when I was 14, and then several times into my teens and late 20s. And I'm 28 now. And it's really interesting where I found so much healing from that trauma has been actually in Earth. And actually it's a practice that I started doing about 2 years ago where I lay on the ground, especially in the spring and summer and fall, and I let bugs and plants kind of brush across my skin. As someone who survived sexual assault, unconsented touch or unexpected touch can be very triggering and can send your whole body into a freeze or a trauma response. And so doing that in the earth really has helped me kind of heal from that. And when I think of my relationship to earth, when I think of the gifts of healing, and when I think of how deeply connected that is in my day-to-day life, it transfers into how I talk about, how I think about how I care for Earth. That consciousness of everything I get and how instrumental it is in my ability to function as a human being is so deeply ingrained into my passion, into why I do what I do. My daughter has climate-induced breathing problems from all the forest fires. She's never known a summer that hasn't been smogged and blacked out by forest fires. And she will have lung issues for the. And that makes me angry. That makes me angry. That makes this work feel very urgent. And that contributes to my ability to come in these spaces as an angry mom. With tokenism, when we're tokenized, you don't see you don't see that. When we're tokenized, you see, oh, a Black person, I'm an Indigenous person, I'm a young woman. So you can stick me on a, not here today, but oftentimes you can stick me on a panel, you can stick me in an audience and check off a box. Or you can bring me in to a space, and I have several disabilities, chronic pain disabilities affecting my pelvic organs, and then I'm recovering from a severe brain bleed where I lost a lot of my vision and speech, memory. And so you can maybe bring me into your space, think it's great, but then aren't willing to accommodate my medical accommodation for me to be there. Creating a harmful workspace or space that at times has led to life-saving surgeries and hospitalizations. Tokenizing is more than just an inconvenience, it's more than just an ethical dilemma. It can be life-threatening. And it definitely detriments your work outputs when we think of what we're all working towards. And so a way that I like to understand it, and I'll wrap up my response here, is that with, I maybe some language piece here. My background is in anti-racism and this kind of language. It's what I've been doing since I was like 11 or 12, I love it. And the language, this really helped me understand and contextualize tokenism. So diversity, inclusion, equity, equality efforts, these are all tools. They're the means to an end. But so often, and this is where we see tokenization happens, so often we position these means as the end itself. This program, bringing in this amount of people, getting this many bums and seats, giving this amount of money to these amount of non-white students. And so that's considered the accomplishment. And that's the danger of only using these frameworks of diversity and inclusion without using a wider consideration. And that's why I associate my work with anti-racism, because anti-racism and DEI are not mutually exclusive. We use DEI practices and frameworks within an anti-racist approach, but with anti-racism, we're not just looking for solutions, we're asking the question, why do we need to do this work in the first place? And when I go into tokenized spaces, they're not asking, why do we need to make this extra effort to bring in Black, Indigenous, racialized people? What about our policies, about our sector, about what we're doing is not attracting, is not accessible, or is not retaining these people? And so when we're using DEI frameworks, we're not required to ask that. And that's often where I see tokenization happen, is when we're not asking the why. And with anti-racism, we're required to ask that why, so that our approaches in moving forward are rooted in the root causes of what we're doing in the first place, why we're doing this work in the first place. And it leads to more effective interventions. And we're doing this proactively too. So we can start this tomorrow and not wait until someone's harmed or tokenized in order to do it. So that's where I see tokenization happens. And I illustrated, again, some of my lived experiences to say that you miss out on all of that benefit, all that qualification, all of that innovation, opportunity for innovation, because all you can see is the color of my skin. And so that's where the danger of tokenization happens. And it starts by not asking the question of why do we have to make these interventions in the first place.
Thank you so much for sharing that, by the way, and being so vulnerable. I feel like I honestly, like, I don't, there's so much practicality in what you said that I have very little to say in response. There's a couple pieces I just want to build on. I think, first of all, what Larissa spoke about the land being like healing and a healer, I think it just illustrates what we were talking about before, where it's like, for so many people, it's property, it's intergenerational wealth, it's our retirement plan, but it's everything. It is literally everything. And I think that piece, that knowledge, just as Larissa said, that when we tokenize, we miss out on that. We miss out on why do we need diverse spaces in the first place? I think that I have been part of so many programs and spaces, climate related or not, where some like white person is coming up to me and being like, how do we diversify this? And like, I'm just like, here we go. And I think that first question of like, yeah, why? And what are we trying to get to, and all of that is so important. But also it's so important to remember who started, who holds this work anyway. And I say work, but it's not been work for so long. It's just been a way of being and a way of living and a love and a respect and a connection to this land. And now we're all here doing this, what is now work, but it was never work in the first place. And I think remembering who owns that work, and like, you know, saying it because we turn it into work, but who owns it? And if those people and those voices and that knowledge and that connection isn't a part of what we're doing, it's not just that we look bad, it's about the fact that we're moving through this space in complete ignorance, and we rob our movement of any kind of power when we do not include and lean on and rely on the people who have been doing this long before we ever knew we were in trouble. That's all.
Thank you for sharing your outrage with us, for sharing your resistance and inviting us in that space. I think a lot of critical points were brought up here, which I just want to quickly highlight again. Thank you, Subashini, for asking us, are we being heard when we enter some of these spaces? We were also reminded of the soul of our movement, and that's maybe being lost, you know, and of healing from earth, of diversity conversations being the beginning of this initiative and not the end. I also want to draw attention to tokenizing not just being a microaggression, not just being something that's an afterthought, but actually causing serious and real harm. So thank you for sharing. That brings us to my last question here, which is, what are reminders and advice that you might have for marginalized folks who are wanting to get into the climate space? And how might we allow for some opportunities of leadership?
Yeah, so I think the way I see it, like if you know a youth wanting to get involved in the space, and I think just kind of being like brave enough to try and I think that is hard, like easy to say and can be hard to do, and like finding like friends and like somebody you can trust to kind of get involved in the movement, and just being, I guess for me, like willing to learn about like any biases we have, willing to learn about the other perspectives of the movement, because I do think ignorance is like a very scary thing and something that's like so urgent, and we do need to learn a lot. So I think for me, I have so much to learn. I think I'm at that stage in my life where I'm like, I'm going to go to university, and like the choices I make there, and to be like mindful about all of them. So I just have so much to learn, and I think that's really important when getting involved in the space, at least in my opinion, to like be willing to learn and to listen. And I think that's what's so beautiful about something like this, being able to hear all these stories. And yeah.
Wow, that was really nice. Thank you. I know quite a few people in our community, up in Slave Lake, who have difficult times making ends meet, difficult times being listened to by the authorities, whether they be the local government or whether it be the provincial government, or sometimes even just the health authority. It's kind of a challenge for people if they're if they're focused on other day-to-day concerns that are about making sure that the kids are being taken care of, whether they're getting fed, or whether they can make their payments, and you know, those kind of things. It's kind of hard for them to get into the climate space, just because their focus is on their personal priorities. Is there opportunities? I think there is, for those that may have some spare time that could, you know, they could actually partake in something. But I know a lot of my people out there do a lot of fishing, so they catch their own fish. It's getting a little sketchy out there on the ice now, but not even a few weeks ago, people were fishing, catching some really nice fish, and in the fall they hunt. And other times of the year they gather herbs and medicines, and others have their gardens that help them to sustain themselves. So, you know, another way of talking about climate is discussing weather and growing. But part of that is, you know, I want to say that I think to people who are mostly urban dwellers is, if you get an opportunity, get out of the city and spend some time in the bush. As she was suggesting, you know, for me, I like nothing better than going into a thick boreal forest that's kind of all dark, with a whole bunch of moss and mushrooms everywhere, right? That's how we got to know one another. The mushrooms, I'm mushroom a picture as well. So you know, the thing about mushrooms is that, you know, when you see the mushroom itself, it's only a small part of this organic creature that is all underneath the forest, interconnecting with its environment, the water and nutrients and the plants. And the plants eat the mushroom, and the mushroom also helps the plants and the trees, all interconnectedness. So just laying down within those mossy beds, letting all of your thoughts go, will help put your mind in a great place. And I try to talk to some of my people who are also into this as well. Is we kind of go out and go mushroom. There's one lady I know who lives about half an hour from my place, and she has no power at all. No power at all. She gets her water every so often. She raises chickens, she raises geese and cats, and just, you know, and this is how she lives. She lives off the land. She's got a bountiful garden within the boreal forest. In the old days, when I was a young boy, I remember walking down streets in Edmonton, and there was literally, people would have a house and they would have a garden right next to it. This is how our people, you know, your great grandfathers and grandmothers lived. You know, they didn't depend on the stores for their sustenance and stuff. So we need to get back to some of that. And to that end, within the Métis Nation, you know, we've actually put together a community garden. Last year we had it up and running, and we gave out several hundred pounds of food to different people that needed them. So they probably still went shopping after we ran out. The point was that we're trying to start a movement, and some of these rural areas need to do that, rather than to pay absorbent prices out at the grocery store, especially for things like that when you can grow it in your own backyard. Really, like the boreal forest ground. It wasn't for the lack of rain, but you know, there's opportunities if you get it right, and if you're down slope, you still have a lot of groundwater to help take care of those vegetables. So I don't really have much to say on this particular topic, just other than what I can say.
So glad you brought up mushrooms. Because what you were just talking about really even was really connected to the two first points I wanted to make around interconnectedness and the importance of ensuring that our spaces remain intergenerational. So with the interconnectedness part, and Tomi, you talked about this in the first response, like recognizing that what's happening elsewhere is affecting what's happening here. And understanding our responsibility to seeking that knowledge out. What's happening to trans kids right now across the prairies is exactly relevant to what's happening in our climate justice spaces. So what's happening and is a reflection of how our truths, how our worldviews of how we control our bodies, how we control the gender binary it is reflected in how we treat Earth and how we understand it. What's happening in Palestine, what's happening in Congo, what's happening in Sudan, that's all connected and is a symptom of our relationships to Earth and how we regard Earth, how we treat Earth, whose truths are positioned as legitimate, whose right and access to Earth is positioned as true and legitimate, and whose is not, and for what reasons. And so this interconnectedness, I've learned so much studying mycology in that way, and that even though we can't see what's going on, that doesn't mean it's not happening. That doesn't mean it's not connected. And with this idea of maintaining intergenerational spaces, what I see a lot of in working with and in climate spaces is that, especially in youth-led spaces, there's a complete kind of overlooking or active barriers being created for older workers and elders to be engaging in our spaces in accessible and respectful ways. And when I look to my parents, my grandparents, and the ways that they lived, it was way more sustainable than the ways that my generation, millennials and younger generations live in many ways. And I think we don't like to admit that often, but there's so much to be learned in terms of repurposing, in terms of skills like sewing and gardening. Oftentimes those are overlooked in many ways because we want to get to the policies, because we want to get to the protest. And I'm not diminishing that by any means, but I'm saying that there's so much value that we can gather and there's so much we can learn when we hold space for intergenerational collaboration and learning. And that comes also from our youth as well. And that's what I love about Indigenous-led spaces is that I very rarely go into one of those spaces and feel like I need to apologize for my daughter. I don't, but sometimes I feel like they expect me to. And we learn so much. We learn so much from our children, especially like our children. So holding caregiver-friendly spaces, whether that's people who are caregiving for older or younger people or people with disabilities as well. I come from a very disabled family. My sister requires constant care. She has autism, she has ADHD, she has chronic anxiety, the whole basket. And a lot of spaces aren't accessible to my mom as a full-time caregiver for her. And so these caregiver-friendly spaces are really crucial when we think of how are we leveraging, again, the collective brilliance and opportunity that presents itself when we truly hold inclusive spaces. And then in terms of like individual level or kind of what you could leave with, some advice, one, this qualification, lived experiences qualification that I've talked about, that all of these stories and all of these connections have come from really thinking about, okay, how has what I've overcome shaped my skills, what I'm passionate about, my values, my knowledge, and really spending time writing that out or expressing it through art, through music, through poetry. It's incredibly empowering. And when I say empowering, I mean that in the most intrinsic way. because I think about this, and I think about it so much. I am less susceptible to imposter syndrome when I go into a space. Especially because I don't have a master's degree, I don't have a lot of typical qualifications for the kind of spaces I end up going into. Or the kind of work that I do, where most of my colleagues have PhDs or at least a master's. But I go in with a very confident and grounded understanding of self and my value in that space because I've thought so much about it. And when I think about the things I haven't overcome, that too is just as valuable. Especially when I consider what I need from that space and articulating that. So I would say ask that for yourself and practice writing that in your biographies, practice writing that in your cover letters, practice writing that in your social media captions and talking about it so that it becomes true to you as much as it can become true for anyone else. And then finally, I would say emphasis on this idea of relationship to earth. I think so often in environmental spaces, we miss that part. Like, how are we holding space for us to be on the land? How are we holding space for us to really appreciate what we're working to protect and care give? I do this through rock climbing. I love rock climbing. I love hiking, but especially being with mountains in that way, in such an intimate way. And it's taught me to not be scared. I often find that when people are uncomfortable with their relationship to earth, they get really scared going out with me when I bring them up to the mountain or when I bring them out to backcountry. And it's interesting to see, even after a few times and talking about it, why are you scared? Oh, it's because I don't know this, oh, it's because of this. And then kind of filling in those gaps of knowledge, they start to see and hold space for a deeper appreciation of everything they're actually getting from being outside. And that transfers into how we care about policy, how we care about what political parties are doing for climate change and climate emergency preparedness. That informs how we care about that. And how we do this very practically, for example, at Future Ancestor Services, is we have a seasonal work cycle. And so when we think about the ways our ancestors existed, we didn't always work with the same energy all year round. That is a very colonial capitalistic legacy. Urgency culture is very much ingrained into the ways that we exist and in our climate movement. So when we go back and think, well, how did we exist before that? Well, we worked with the seasons, we listened to our bodies. And so we have a seasonal work cycle where we ask, okay, what work, what demand do we have in the spring and the summer and the fall and the winter? Okay, what do our bodies need? And as a team of all disabled, neurodivergent, chronically depressed, and chronically anxious team, my entire team has one or more of that. We all navigate that. When we ask this question, it becomes an accessibility practice too, because people on the West Coast who deal with chronic depression in the rainy season, they're going to have a harder time. Their work capacity fluctuates. So when we have an open conversation about how we are connected to Earth and how that affects our capacities, then we're able to plan for that work accordingly. And almost more importantly, plan for rest. So in the winter and the summer, my team, we almost all of us take a full month off, at least. And every season we're expected to spend at least a week, like on the land, like away from our computers, away from our phones. And this translates directly into how we approach our climate justice work. And when we think about this idea of sustainability, making sustainability work sustainable. And incorporating rest into our understanding of our work in sustainability. So I'll wrap up with a couple of really great reading recommendations that have really helped me shape my understanding of rest. So Rest is Resistance by Tricia Hersey. Rest is Resistance. And she's an incredible Black activist, author, academic from the US. That has really led a movement around decolonizing our understanding of urgency and productivity. So there's Living Resistance by Caitlin B. Curtis. And she is incredible Indigenous, I believe, Potawatomi. She's from the same people as Robin Wall Kimmerer, actually. Incredible book. Pleasure Activism by Anne Marie Brown is a great book. And again, these are unlikely spaces that you'll find like climate, environmental work, but it is deeply, deeply tied. And when we think of our relationship to Earth, all of these authors really speak to that in a context that not only can, or in a way that can not only shape the way that we approach this work, but that can also shape the way that we live our lives. And that's where we're going to find the most sustainable place to do this work.
I'm literally writing down the Look at that. That sounds so good. Yeah, no, I love that. I think that so much of this conversation has kind of come back to that idea of like connectedness, and I really like that we sort of naturally found our way there. I also like what you said about it feeling just really easy to kind of get involved in the work, but it actually is really difficult to just know like, how do I even get started? What does this look like? And I think that's so true. And I think when I was just kind of like starting to get interested and wanted to get involved, I was also kind of just like, yeah, what does this look like? Where do I even go? And honestly, the reason I was interested in this was because I was like, oh, this seems like a really important policy issue and that I should care about and do something about. And even now, I'm like, I care way more about this now than I did 20 minutes ago. Just like hearing these stories and hearing people talk about it. And so that would be my recommendation, like ask people, why do you care about this? Because it's one thing to come at it from that more like policy, cerebral mindset. And then it's another thing to be like, wait, no, like this is our home. This means so much more than we think to so many different people. To me, that just haven't connected to it. There are so many just like really beautiful, rich stories that even we just heard today that make me care about this way more. And so I think getting started, there is a host of issues to dedicate your time to and to dedicate your efforts to. And so I think whatever space you're in, it is really important that it's meaningful to you and that you care. And I love the phrasing of we have to make sustainability work sustainable, because I think that there is such a masterfully strategic way that this area is designed to make often marginalized people burn out really, really quickly. And I'm like, yeah, it's designed that way. That's what's supposed to happen. And so I think that the idea of, as cliche as this is, having your why or whatever, prioritizing your rest, like all of that is so important. But I think also just really connecting with other people and connecting with their stories of why is this important to you? Why do you care about this? Why does this matter? It's just a really important perspective shift, I think, to really understand the urgency, depth, and vastness and sort of beauty of this this kind of crisis that we're all in.
Thank you all of you for reminders of what's most important in the movement and the critical changes that we want to bring about. I particularly loved what Subashini said about positioning yourself as a learner, approaching the space with a mindset of, I don't know everything that I need to know, and there's a lot more that I can learn from birds, from each other. I also liked our discussions around the goals of the movement. And perhaps if some people are not interested, then maybe those goals also need to shift a little bit. Maybe there needs to be a middle ground there. And the everyday struggles that folks face just to survive can't be ignored within that. It also reminded me of pretty much what all of you said reminded me of what Ajele told us about how we can't have single issue struggles because we don't live single issue lives. our movements need to be more intersectional. They need to incorporate some of those queer, ableist, sexuality-related, gender-related, race-related concerns that shape our lives and can't be separated and siloed into boxes. I also want to draw attention to the interconnectedness that we heard about and the intergenerational aspects of the movement, which need to be more central rather than also siloed. The extractionist mindset that we have towards land needs to be deconstructed. That's also something important that I heard. I really believe there's kind of something that came out of what everything that you guys said was how environmentalism can't quite exist without Indigenous sovereignty. It can't exist without liberation of all peoples, but also animals and our relationship with them. I also, lastly, I love so much about this conversation. I'm just trying to highlight some of that. But the part of rest as resistance, and by the way, I love pleasure activism by excellent book, highly recommend. But that book also reminded me of how we not only need to find resistance in joy, but joy in resistance. And those things are just so interconnected with each other. Yeah, my last, we do have a few more minutes, and Larissa, you kind of beat me to this, but I was gonna ask lastly how we might, going forward from here, expand our knowledge in some of the directions that have been suggested here. So any resources that you might know off the top of your head, no pressure though, you can just, any movies, documentaries, books, anything that you've learned from recently that you might also benefit from.
I heard from him, wish I knew what this came out of. I think it was a school in BC. But I was at some sort of climate event and I heard the term messy hope there for the first time. And I'm trying to remember if it was like a zine or a publication. But there was kind of a climate group out there that put out something around messy hope. If you just look that up, you'll find it. But I kind of was reading through that and I thought they did a really, really good job of kind of teaching how to hold those multiple things at once, how to hold those really massive feelings that come with climate anxiety, that come with trying to face such a complex, huge issue, but then also the feelings of joy and resistance, the feelings of optimism and hope and connection. And yeah, I thought it was just really well illustrated, so I would definitely check that out.
I was just thinking specifically, Walter, about what you were saying about reaching rural communities where they're at. I was just at Métis Nation of Saskatchewan's wellness conference in Saskatoon, and the topic was on aging together, and really that was what we heard throughout the entire weekend, was that the social media, and especially the social media only kind of approach, is not working. And quite a few years ago, I was on a contract with a federal ministry, and I had to do research for population-based marketing. And my assignment was Indigenous, rural, and urban across what is currently Canada. And just for anyone who's doing that kind of work, who's trying to get information out, some insights that have really kind of helped me as we try doing that in some of our own work and with our clients, is that the marketing research found that especially friendship centers, public libraries, and other kind of public service spaces are really great hotspots for getting paper-based posters and information out. Obviously, local radio stations, any kind of public trend, especially if we're urban and we're trying to reach people who don't have phones, who don't have access to internet. Public transit promotion is really, really key. Food banks, grocery stores, door-to-door knocking, so identifying perhaps a community-based organization, especially religious-based organizations, making those partnerships, where people spend their time. And then making sure that we're not missing out again on the people who don't have access to smartphones and internet, because there's so much really valuable knowledge, because oftentimes in spaces like this, most or everyone has a post-secondary degree and experience. And that shapes all of our perspectives on climate, environment, space, issues, solutions. And so when we consider reaching those people who we aren't immediately thinking of, I think it's really important, but those are some of the ways, I'm just thinking from the top of my head from that marketing research that really helped us in terms of practically getting words out there.
And if I could add just maybe one more thing, this may be a little bit more easier in a rural setting, but getting to know the town reporters, and if they're usually they take on a balance of articles. Sometimes usually got several people in the office. One's political, one does general news, and others community events. It's good to know a few and to give a few stories now and again on different gatherings and, you know, the purpose of it. And, you know, you get a little bit of if you want to do that kind of thing, yeah, get to learn some of the reporters in the area and get your story out to a lot of people, Okay.
And I guess I could add like maybe a resource if there's like some really cool like arts, like theater, that kind of happens. Like I got to like see like a really cool production by Downstage, like in the Arts Commons, and it was like it was kind of called, I think from what I remember, All Good Things Must Begin, and there was like this beautiful collaboration about like are these stories related to climate and to kind of like see that in an art space is like quite interesting, at least for me. And like I think there's a lot of poetry and music out there, and I think even if it's you just kind of find like an outlet for all these emotions, I think it's really beautiful to see the art side of things, and if that's something you're interested in, it's cool to explore.
Thank you. I could wait to check literally all of that. Those sound like amazing resources. But yeah, with that, I'll just conclude with saying that I want to stand in solidarity with all of you and the amazing work that you're doing. And yeah, please join me in thanking our panelists for sharing their resistance and nurturing ours today.